Hi! Welcome to the second stop on our Southeast Asia trip, Gili Meno. To bring you up to speed, in September of 2019, we flew from San Francisco to Singapore, where we spent a day and a half. From Singapore, we flew to the island of Bali in Indonesia, where we spent 2 days and 3 nights. The Bali leg of the trip was the first video in this series, which you can link to up there. The only way to get from Bali to Meno is by boat. And we booked with Ekajaya Fast Boats out of Padang Bay. One of the reasons we chose them was that they offered door-to-door shuttle service included in the cost of the ticket. So the 1-hour ride was free to us. We had everything packed the night before and were up an hour ahead of our scheduled pickup time of 7:30. It's a good thing too, as the shuttle arrived right on time. If this is your first visit to our travel section, you may be wondering why I'm not showing cinematic montages of the drive through the early morning mist. Well, we don't travel to make videos. We make videos of our travels. So sometimes the cameras are put away to focus on logistics. This isn't a lifestyle channel, guys. These videos are meant to encourage people to get out and experience the world. Especially our fellow Americans, a mere 37% of whom even have a valid passport. As well as to share the methods and strategies we use in planning and an idea of the costs occurred along the way. We made great time getting to Padang Bay. In fact, we arrived so early we were able to get on the boat that was just getting ready to leave, saving us 2 full hours. After the paperwork, we walked to the pier with our porter, a good-natured, rail-thin man who struggled under the weight of our luggage. I offered several times to carry my own backpack, but he would have none of it. As I mentioned in the previous video, Indonesia is a massive country made up of over 17,000 islands. The area we're talking about involves just 5 of them: Bali, Lombok, Gili Trawangan, Gili Meno, and Gili Air. The Gilis are these 3 tiny islands off the northwestern coast of Lombok. Our boat took the standard route: Bali to Gili Trawangan, to Gili Meno, to Gili Air. Then on to Lombok, where it turns around and makes a beeline back to Bali. The porters load everybody's luggage as passengers mill about, waiting for the call to board. Everyone is given a sticker to put on their shirt indicating their final destination. Now, our initial plan had been to just use Gili Meno as our home base. In our research, we'd learned that each of the Gilis caters to a different crowd. Gili T is the party island, Gili Air is the family island, and Gili Meno is the couples island. So we had thought a couple of day trips to the other Gilis might be fun. Our first indication that Gili T might be a pass for us was on the boat ride. Now, these boats are designed for speed and efficiency. They're not meant to be particularly comfortable. So the seats are narrow and don't recline. The rows are also tightly spaced. We hadn't been aboard long before the first passengers wearing Gili T stickers raged onto the boat. It was a group of young women, and based on their dialect, they were from Australia. Based on their behavior, they had just escaped from a zoo. They climbed onto the seats, pulling and pushing on the surrounding rows as they went, yelling across the cabin, and generally acting like they owned the place.
They're called laddettes or yobbettes, a new breed of young woman hell-bent on outdoing the blokes. And they're truly frightening. Violent, selfish, with no sense of shame.
Tonight, we're going to go out there and be the bloody blokes, get laid, get your tits out, and drink down large amounts of piss. Everyone's getting laid!
Eventually, we came to realize that the majority of passengers were of similar bent and heading for Gili T. On the plus side, the Ekajaya staff came through the cabin at regular intervals with refreshments, so I enjoyed a few bintangs and some Pringles during the ride. There was also a movie playing in each cabin, and while the engines were too loud to hear the dialogue, they did have the captions on, and in English, lucky for us. Now, there's also seating on the roof, but we were kind of confused as to when and how you're allowed to go up there, so we didn't. It takes about 90 minutes to get to Gili T, and Meno is another 15 minutes or so, depending on how long it takes for folks to disembark and board. And when we saw the sea of humanity on the dock and all over the shore at Gili T, that sealed the deal for us. We decided then and there not to bother visiting Party Island. Gili T is much larger than Meno, which is the smallest of the three, and Gili T has a pier for the boats to moor to. Meno doesn't, so the fast boat is met by smaller launches that are really just floating platforms with outboard motors and no seats. They need to navigate these ungainly craft right up to the beach, as the harbor on Meno is a harbor in name only. So it may take them a while to deposit you on dry land depending on the tide and what the waves are like at the time. Gili Air appears from the satellite views to also have a natural harbor and piers for the boats to tie up to. As I alluded to earlier, we chose to forego the visit to Air as well as Trawangan, but we skipped Air mostly because we just fell so in love with Meno. During Wendy's initial research, she had expected that I would most want to stay on Gili Air. In addition to being called the Family Island, Air is also referred to as the Goldilocks Island. It's larger and more developed than Meno, with more amenities and such, but without the reputation of Gili T. So the trip from Buddha Cottage in Ubud to Gili Meno, including the shuttle ride, was just under $100 US for two people. Now, when we finally set foot on Meno, we were faced with the dilemma of how to get to our lodgings. From the harbor on the eastern side of the island to where we were staying at Blue Coral Bungalows at the northern tip. The walk along the shore is just under 1 mile, not too bad if you're just leisurely enjoying the island, but a different proposition when lugging heavy backpacks through dry sand. See, there are no motor vehicles allowed on the Gilis, so your only options on Meno for wheeled transportation are rented bicycles or these horse-drawn carts. However, also during our research, we came across a video that said the horses on Meno were malnourished and mistreated. Loving animals as we do, we were in a bit of a pickle as to how to get to our bungalow. It was then that we bumped into an English expat who owns a business on Meno. We no doubt looked pitiful and lost, so she offered to help. Once we had explained, she agreed that Blue Coral was a bit too far to walk with all of our stuff. Happily, she was also able to assure us that while there had been a time when the horses weren't really properly cared for, they are now treated by veterinarians from Bali and their owners educated in proper care and nutrition. Armed with this new information, we hired the closest driver for the ride through the confusing inter-island road network. I have some experience training and caring for horses, and from what I saw, the horses on Meno appeared to be healthy and well looked after. While checking in at Blue Coral, I happened to notice these two items of interest on the wall. The first being a photograph of Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, meeting with JFK in 1961. Clearly, that event was important to our hosts, seeing that they were still displaying the photo nearly 60 years later. The second being this whiteboard, listing the bookings at Blue Coral along with the countries of residence. Of 14 listed, 1 each from Spain, Belgium, New Zealand, Poland, France, England, the United Kingdom, and Indonesia, 3 from Germany, and 2 from the Netherlands. Wendy and I were the only guests from the US, or even North America, for that matter. Check-in only took a few minutes since everything had already been taken care of online, and we were shown to our bungalow, which is when I shot the following clip. Just got the Gili Meno, taking a stroll on the beach. The water's beautiful, as you can see. And thought it might be fun to show you our commute when we're done in the water. Gotta watch your step. Broken cord. Oh, what's this?
Hello, Kevin.
Hi there.
Missing you.
How are you?
Welcome.
This is lovely. It's such a long walk from the beach. I'm exhausted. Would you mind opening the
Absolutely.
bathroom door? Watch your step. Open to the outside a little bit. Shower. Throne. And this is what we'll see every morning. It'll do. Not too shabby, right? And I could just leave it there and you'd all be none the wiser, but then when I tell you how much we paid, I would be lying. So here's what happened. A couple of minutes after I shot that video, the guy from the check-in desk came back, more than a little embarrassed and very apologetic, to let us know he had made a mistake and brought us to the wrong bungalow. Ours was in fact not the first one facing the water, but the fourth one back. And we're not talking about a large complex here. Every bungalow's on the beach. When Wendy books our trips, she always uses the search filter function to eliminate properties that don't offer what we're looking for or don't have vacancies that fit our specs. She always ticks the boxes for things like free cancellation, private bathroom, beachfront, to name a few. But she also enters a price range. Now, we were both a little confused about the mix-up, and Wendy was kind of peeved. After being shown to the second bungalow, we went back to the desk to speak with the owner. He pointed out that the price we paid was virtually half the cost of the unit closest to the water. So there was no way that one was ours. It honestly wasn't that big of a deal to us. We don't tend to spend much time in our rooms anyway. The main concern was whether we had been tricked or misled in some way. We were on a walk later that day when it dawned on me what had happened. While setting her search parameters, Wendy had specified a maximum daily rate. So any of the results that came back would be less than or equal to that number. Her max number for lodging in Indonesia was $50 US per night, which is just over 715,000 rupiah. We ended up paying just under $39 per night, 556,000 rupiah, and the waterfront bungalow went for 1,000,000 rupiah per night, which is around 70 US. So basically, we got the bungalow closest to the water that was under our stated price cap, which was identical to the first one other than location. On day 2, our neighbors left, and we were able to switch to their bungalow, which was one spot closer to the water, but more importantly was offset from the ones in front of it, so we once again had a direct view of the water without paying the waterfront price. Now, we both grew up in California and spent much of our childhoods at the beach or elsewise in the water. Wendy in Southern California and me here in Santa Cruz. Wendy has also been scuba certified since she was a teenager. I recently got my open water certification too, but hadn't yet during this trip. So once we were settled into our bungalow, we each grabbed mask fins and snorkel and headed for the water. We brought our gear from home, but there are dive shops on Meno where you can rent gear, and many of the resorts also have gear you can borrow or rent. The tide was very low, so there wasn't much to see, but it was still a lot of fun. And while we were on that first excursion, I recorded the following clip.
And let's see, that over there, where the mountains are, that's Lombok, where we're going in a couple of days. This right here is Meno, where we're staying. And the little island in between Meno and Lombok is Air. And that's the sorority fraternity island over there. Holy crap.
Meno is known as a couple of islands.
If you guys had seen the douchery that got on because you wear a sticker on the boat to get here which island you're going to, and there was all of a sudden this influx of people
Kids.
wearing Gili T stickers, which I can never remember the full name. It's got a long ass name. Prolongin or something. We'll put it in the thing. We'll make a graphic. But it was like a sorority walked onto the boat. And then the fraternity. So if that's what you're into, that's your island, baby.
And the people, the crowds.
Oh yeah, yeah, and the whole shoreline was just full of people. And once again, hello.
Where we are all to ourselves.
So yeah, I think we chose wisely.
On this first day, we established the one constant of our stay on Meno: sunset at Sláinte. Yes, you heard me right. There is an Irish pub on Meno, and it looks like this. Blue Coral's location is excellent for most everything. However, being on the kind of eastern curve, sightlines directly west are blocked by the island itself. So by walking a mere 200 meters to Sláinte, the view west opens up and the accommodations are lovely. Wendy still laughs at how perfectly these beanbags on the beach suited me. Don't they suit everybody? Anyway. After the sun was down, we returned to Blue Coral for dinner, where we lucked into one of the best meals we've ever had. See, I'm not usually a big fan of seafood, but I rolled the dice and ordered calamari steak, while Wendy had black snapper. Fresh from the ocean and grilled to perfection. I could not get over how delicious the calamari was, and made videos to send to family because I knew they'd be shocked to see me gorging on seafood. After dinner, a few of our fellow travelers were sharing a beach bonfire with some of the locals. They invited us to join them, and shortly after we sat down, one of the locals offered me some homemade rice wine. Now, I had seen a video about Gili tea in which the guy specifically warned viewers to refuse any offers of this local brew. His claim is that there are some bad operators on Gili tea who make a particularly potent version and use it to rob or otherwise take advantage of people once they're blind drunk. I have no idea if this is true or not, but I jokingly refused the wine, saying I knew what he was trying to do. He laughed and replied, No, this is what we drink. To make his point, he downed the shot and poured another, which I accepted. Guitars were brought out and photos were shared, as was more wine. By me, that is. Wendy had the good sense to limit her intake. Eventually, one of our hosts came down to the beach around 10 p.m., I think, to shut us down due to the noise we were making, which is one of the things I appreciate about Meno. It's really not a party island. If you're looking to party into the wee hours, I suggest trying Gili tea. As it was, we had a nice time visiting, singing, and drinking at the bonfire, but we're also glad to be able to turn in early without worrying about revelers keeping us awake, or being the revelers irritating our neighbors. I think I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow, thanks in no small part to the rice wine, and Wendy followed soon after, but was awakened later by a surprise visitor. Cats are pretty common around the island, and one of them seemed to believe that we were in her bungalow. She managed to get the door open somehow, and Wendy awoke to find her sitting quietly at the foot of the bed. She even followed Wendy into the bathroom. Finally, she was escorted outside so Wendy could get back to sleep. Day 2 started with breakfast on the beach. Eggs, toast, fresh fruit, coffee for me, tea for Wendy, bottled water, or a large selection of fresh squeezed juice. Fresh squeezed juice. Fresh squeezed juice. It's hard to say, harder than you might think. Keep in mind that if you visit these islands, make sure you only drink bottled water. I'd suggest only accepting unopened bottles too, just to be safe. More on this in a bit. After breakfast, it was time for the actual reason we went to Meno, snorkeling. Blue Coral, like many of the resorts on Meno, has its own boat and guides for snorkeling trips. To really experience all of the excellent sights around the island, you really do kind of need a boat. You could walk around to each site and swim out, if you were so inclined, but hiring a boat and guide is very affordable, efficient, and relaxing. Plus, these guys know where the best sites are, where you're most likely to find turtles and other fauna, along with other valuable skills, like the ability to free dive as deep as 30 feet. On the ride out from the beach, I was marveling at how clear the water was. In 20 feet, you could see straight to the bottom. At our first stop, the water was a bit colder than I had expected, mainly I think because we were in a rather deep area, and by no means do I mean actually cold, it was just colder than I had expected. And initially I was a little confused as to why they had decided to stop there. As I said, it was pretty deep and seemingly pretty empty. But I just trusted our guide and followed him and Wendy. All of a sudden, he pointed ahead and off to the right, and holy crap, there it was. Talk about a bucket list item. Just look at it, cruising along without a care in the world other than finding something to eat. And I mean that literally. Once sea turtles reach this side, they have no natural predators, and in these waters, they're a protected species. Unfortunately, I have a brain that likes to try and kill me with rapid onset anxiety attacks. So rather than just enjoying this moment and continuing to glide along behind this amazing creature, my focus was suddenly diverted. I'm going to turn up the volume here a bit so you can hear what I was hearing in that moment. Do you hear that crinkling, crackling sound? As I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time in the ocean growing up, and I had never heard anything like that before. In addition, Wendy told me she didn't hear anything. The louder it got, the more obsessed I became. Finally, it occurred to me that the sound was coming from inside my skull. Perhaps the sound of capillaries in my brain rupturing, leading to a stroke, obviously. And in addition, the cool temperature of the water had my chest constricting a bit. So in addition to feeling a stroke approaching, there was also clearly something wrong with my lungs, or maybe my heart. If I was about to have a medical emergency, I determined it would be better for it to happen on the boat. The fact that I'd had dozens of panic attacks before was beside the point. Anyone who's experienced this can relate. This time was the real deal, and I could not ignore it. At the same time, I didn't want to ruin things for Wendy, so I tried to act blasé. It didn't work. She could see it all over my face. Luckily, she also knew that I was going to be fine, so she stayed in the water while I swam back to the boat. Later, I learned that the sound I was hearing is made by crustaceans like crabs and shrimp. Sound travels so well in water that you can't discern where it's coming from. All sounds come from all sides, hence me feeling like the noise was inside my head. Add to that Wendy saying that she didn't hear anything, my overactive brain ran away with the what-ifs. Wendy has been in the water in more geographically diverse areas than I have. Mexico, Costa Rica, Belize, and Hawaii, to name a few. The clicking wasn't a novelty for her, it was just normal background noise. Funnily enough, months later, when going through footage from the trip, I discovered that there were other locations where the underwater noises, including the clicking, were much louder, and I didn't even notice. In retrospect, I think there was another aspect of the moment with the turtle that heightened my anxiety without me realizing it. We had followed the turtle into this abyss. Suddenly, there was no visible bottom. How far out had we gone? Anyway, Wendy stayed in the water with our guide for another 15 minutes or so. They found and followed several more turtles while I recuperated on the boat. By the time we had picked them up and headed for the next site, I was feeling normal again and ready to get back in the water. Our guides took us clockwise around the island, stopping at all of the popular sites, the statues, the shipwreck, the wall, the coral garden, where you can see the namesake of our lodgings, blue coral, which only lives in this part of the world. Yes, I said lives. Many people don't realize that coral are animals. The structures we see are the creature's exoskeleton. They are very fragile and very important to ocean ecology. Storms, earthquakes, climate change, and human behavior, like illegal blast fishing, all conspire to damage the coral reefs in this area and around the world. Even though we visited after the busiest time of the year, many of the snorkeling sites were still pretty crowded. It's kind of amazing though. As long as you're looking down, you can feel like you're in your own little world until you look up or someone swims into view. It's fun to people watch too. There are people of all ages, shapes, sizes, and skill levels out there. One of my favorites was this guy, just doing the old dead man's float. My man can't even be bothered to wear fins. It's like, I'll just hover here. If it isn't in my eye line, it's not worth seeing. The statue site was by far the most crowded spot that day, due to its notoriety on social media. If you've seen our Bali video, you know that popular and crowded are adjectives we try to steer away from. Interestingly, we were the only people at Turtle Point when we were there, which is far more exciting than the statues. Once our circuit of the island was complete, we rinsed our gear and set it aside to dry. Each bungalow has a spigot at the bottom of the steps to rinse off sand before going inside. Pretty handy. Now it was time for lunch. We decided to take a walk and find somewhere other than blue coral to eat. We wanted to conserve our cash as much as possible because at the time there was no source of currency on Meno. I've noticed that an ATM, or what I think some call a cash point, has been installed near the harbor since our visit. Anyway, we wanted to find a place that took credit cards. There aren't many on the island, but they do exist. We finally found a spot about halfway between blue coral and the harbor. Prior to ordering, we confirmed that they accepted cards. When we were done eating, however, well, I'll let then Kevin tell you about it.
So, one of the interesting things that we've learned about island travel is you don't always get what you think you're going to get when you go to eat or get a drink, because you're on an island and they only get one shipment of, you know, fresh fruit per day or whatever other supplies they need. They don't have this big storeroom in the back to be able to, you know, just go into the back and get more stuff. So in the meal that we just had, we had no light rum was the first thing that came up, right?
Yeah.
And then
No pepperoni.
yeah, I ordered a pizza in Indonesia, shoot me. She got a burger, so there was no light rum
For my mojito.
for a mojito, so She had to get, what did you get the first time? Oh yeah, lime splash or something.
Vodka and lime.
Vodka and lime. And then for my pizza, there was no pepperoni, so they used bacon instead. And then, wasn't there one other thing?
And then they couldn't ring up the tab.
Well,
on
that
the
was the
printer.
final thing.
And then
Well,
they
no, the
couldn't-
first
then
thing was they
run the
couldn't
card.
print out, the printer wasn't working, so they couldn't print the receipt. So the guy had to handwrite the whole receipt, which he did, itemized everything. It was
It was
great.
like no big deal, but
Yeah.
he thought it was like the end of the world. And we're like, no, that's okay. That's
Right.
okay.
And then at the very end of it, their credit card machine wasn't working.
Now we're
So-
walking all the way back.
And we ate there specifically because we didn't want to burn through cash for this meal. We were going to use a credit card. And only certain places here accept credit cards, so you have to find them. They're like needles in a haystack.
Yeah.
And so we asked ahead of time. They do take them, but their card reader's not working. So now we got to go back to the bungalow, get cash, walk back to the restaurant.
And they trust us.
pay the-
They're like, yeah, no problem. I trust you.
Right. And this is not meant to be a bad story. This is just
How things are
this is
different
just
here.
things are different. You know, you just got to roll with it, and it's amazing.
I shared that story for two reasons. First, the moral of rolling with the punches. Second, because the fellow we dealt with at that restaurant turned out to be a valuable resource. You see, the only part of our trip that Wendy didn't have locked in ahead of time was the crossing from Meno to Lombok. While we were settling up for lunch, after our walk back to the bungalow, he asked us where we were going from Meno. We explained that Lombok was next, but didn't offer any further information. He kept pressing. How were we planning to make the crossing? Well, we didn't know, but we would figure something out. He then told us that he had some friends with a speedboat and an uncle on Lombok who owned a car service and lived in the area we were heading to. I remained silent at that point, but Wendy perked her ears. And this is how we first met our friend, New Rule. We returned the next day to iron out the details and the price. We had gone from not only no plan for the crossing, but also no overland ride to our lodgings on Lombok, to having the entire leg wrapped up. We took another walk after lunch, this time in the opposite direction across the north end of the island. One stop was here at Warong Diana, where we relaxed and had a drink. On August 5th, 2018, there was an earthquake on Lombok, measuring 7.0 on the Richter scale. Being from California, Wendy and I are quite familiar with earthquakes. The largest one I've been through was on October 17th, 1989, centered here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Depending on who you believe, it registered either 6.9 or 7.1, so right in the same zone as the 2018 Lombok quake, which was the largest and strongest to hit Lombok in recorded history. In addition to devastating Lombok, it also did significant damage to the Gilis, some of which was still evident during our visit, in the form of damaged and abandoned properties. We returned to Slancha for the sunset, after which I recorded the following clip.
What's that? You say it's time to leave the bar and your beer's still mostly full? Just take it with you. Indonesia, baby.
On day 3, we decided to explore the island some more, starting with a walk around the interior. We hadn't been away from the coast really since we arrived. And this is the part of the island where the locals and some of the property owners live. So the vibe is very different than on the coast. You'll find the occasional warung along these roads too, and it was at one of these that we decided to rent bicycles. Now, I usually have an excellent sense of direction, but that day I got myself turned around. My intention was to head down to the southeast, but somehow ended up bringing us out on the west side of the island. Normally this wouldn't be a big deal on such a small island, but I had two things conspiring against me. First, we had rented bikes with very narrow tires that are only really much use on pavement. And second, there are long stretches where the only passage is over soft, dry sand. which meant pushing our now useless and getting heavier by the minute bikes. Wendy was beginning to feel a little punky at this point too, so pushing the bike didn't improve her mood at all. But then there was a moment of levity that makes me laugh to this day. I came across this sign and quickly snapped a photo of it, followed immediately by this shot of a less than thrilled Wendy and her albatross of a bicycle. Finally, we reached the turtle sanctuary, which we would have reached in less than half the time on foot had we just walked down the beach from our bungalow. Still and yet, Meno isn't a big place, and in the long run, it was more of a hiccup than anything. The sanctuary is very cool. It's run by one guy who funds it purely on donations. Indonesia is home to 6 of the 7 species of sea turtle, most of which are either threatened or endangered. I mentioned earlier that they are all protected species, but they are still poached, especially on Bali, for meat and tourist trinkets made from their shells. The green turtle is the most hunted for meat, while the hawksbill for its shell. So, don't buy turtle shell souvenirs. Only 1 in 1,000 of these little guys actually survives, and it takes them 25 years before they can breed. In which time they often get hit by boats or ships, get caught in fishing gear, etc., etc. It's a rough gig for a long time before they get to cruise around like the one we saw on our first day. The proprietor here keeps them safe for 8 to 12 months in hopes of giving them a better chance. A donation can buy you the opportunity to release a turtle, which, with fingers crossed for its 50-plus year journey. Ours was a little sleepy at first, but with a nudge was soon on its way. Very, very cool. Be sure to stop by and drop off a generous donation when you're on Meno. When we were finished at the sanctuary, we returned the bikes and headed back to Blue Coral. Wendy was now feeling decidedly worse than punky. She went to the bungalow to lay down, so I headed back to Slancha.
Evening, everybody.
To relax on my favorite beanbag and have a few beers.
I've decided to come hang out at our favorite Irish bar. It's called Slancha, if you'd like to have a look. This is where we've been coming for the last couple of days to watch the sunset. And so I'm just chilling here with my beverage and whatnot. And tomorrow morning we head off for Lombok. So we'll see how that goes.
Now, what made Wendy sick? We're still not sure. One hypothesis is related to her beverage choices. I mostly drank water, beer, or coffee while we were on Meno. I did have some lime juice with breakfast. Wendy drank juice at several locations and also had a few cocktails. And the one thing all of her drinks had in common was ice. As far as I know, all of the Warrens we stopped at used bottled water for their ice, but if one of them chose to cut corners, that might explain how Wendy felt that afternoon. However, there's a second possibility that's just as, if not more likely. Wendy has a history of stomach problems when traveling. Some people's digestive systems are just more sensitive to even minor changes. And her tummy continued to bother her off and on for the rest of our time in Indonesia, so I kind of feel like this is the more likely scenario. After a nap, she joined me at Slancha, where we ended up eating dinner. I ordered schnitzel, and it was delicious. I absolutely love that I ate a German dish at an Irish pub in Indonesia. And it really was fantastic, to the point that I walked back to the kitchen to let them know how much I enjoyed it. The staff at Slancha were a really great group. They were half the reason I kept returning there, even with other restaurants on the same stretch of beach. We returned to our bungalow and packed most of our gear before going to bed. Early on the 4th day, we were up to finish packing and meet Nurul on the beach in preparation of crossing to Lombok. He arrived right on time but hadn't yet heard from the boat captain. So we decided to just hang out at Blue Coral until we knew when they'd arrive. It was around this time that a fellow approached us selling jewelry. Wendy had a look through his samples and found one that she liked. I myself saw a couple that had elements that I liked, but not enough to buy. So he offered to make me one to order. He took out one of those organizer boxes stuffed with various beads. I just like the black volcanic beads. So he made me a really cool, simple bracelet of varying sizes with a couple of tiger's eyes. Cool. At some point, I remember New Rule apologized for the boat guys being on island time, but we really weren't worried about it. It was still early in the day, and we weren't in a big hurry. I guess it was after maybe an hour that we got the call that they were on their way to the harbor and we should walk down to meet them. During the time that we'd been waiting, the wind had picked up quite a bit and the waves at the harbor were crazy. This clip is after 15 minutes or so of watching them battling to get the boat to shore without hitting any of the other vessels. If you can't tell, they have an anchor off the front of the boat and a line running to the shore where harbor workers are trying to help reel them in. It was really amazing to watch. They never panicked or even seemed flustered. They just kept after it, responding to changes as they arose until they were close enough for us to clamber aboard over the stern. I was even more impressed when I realized how young these guys were. Now, the ride to Lombok wasn't exactly comfortable, thanks to the chop, but our pilot was confident and competent, as was his first mate at the back. Funnily enough, while researching Meno for this episode, I stumbled across a blog with this photo at the bottom of the page. Holy crap, it's the same freaking boat. Small world. One of the reasons that we had delayed finding our ride to Lombok was that the ferry services and fast boats only go to the public boat harbor here at the northwestern corner. In hopes of avoiding crowds and traffic, we asked to be taken to any location south of there on the west coast. The further south, the better, as that would be closer to our final destination. We ended up landing here, at Pelabuhan Teluk Nare. It may not look like much of a difference, but this strategy saved us quite a bit of time. From here, we met our driver Dan, but that is a story for another time. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next leg of our trip, Lombok.